All right, we're going to get started now. I need to activate my captions. Got my steps out of order there, but looks like the captions are on now. Okay, picking up where we left off in chapter 11, we're moving now into the central nervous system processing of the touch pathways. First thing to say, these various pathways that lead us from the peripheral nerves into the spine maintain a functional separation of different aspects of the signal. A big part of that is the subdivision of the activation of all of those various corpuscles that are used for just basic touch, like to detect different aspects of an object, versus the pain pathway. Right? That's one of the major subdivisions here that we see. These signals are kept separate here. Primarily, though, for all of that touch information, but especially, of course, the regular just touching and recognizing objects, this is going to up the brain, up the spine, and up into the brainstem, of course, through the midbrain. But it goes to the thalamus. And if you recall, we have already mentioned the importance of the thalamus as being a relay center for things like we had the LGN, lateral geniculate nucleus, for the visual pathway, and then there was the MGN, the medial geniculate nucleus, for the auditory pathway. And here we have the somatosensory thalamus, and this is going to be a pathway that takes the tactile information and relays it to the cortex, what we call the somatosensory cortex, like the visual cortex and auditory cortex. We have that. It's going to be the main target of this nerve path here, but it's going to take us into the parietal lobe. And it's going to be in the very front of the parietal lobe, right behind the frontal lobe, called the postcentral gyrus, because it sits right behind the central sulcus that subdivides the frontal lobe from the parietal lobe of the brain. One of the things that we want to understand about the somatosensory area is that it is subdivided into different regions that map out regions of the body. So we see essentially a body map here, or a body representation within the somatosensory cortex, so that regions of activation on the palm of the hand, for example, all map to neighboring regions of the somatosensory cortex. And so in that way, the various locations of the body are mapped out in the somatosensory area. But what's important also to say about this is that the size or amount of cortical regions that are given to different body parts here are not proportional to the size of the body part. You might think, okay, your back or your legs are some of your larger body parts, so that would get more cortical processing, right? But it turns out it's not about the size of the body part as much as it is the sensory sensitivity of that body part. So if we think about how the fact that we use our hands for a lot of touching, that means that even though the hands are comparatively small body parts, they get a lot of cortex dedicated to them, right? Because there's a lot of receptors that are packed in very densely in all of that hairless skin. And one of the reasons, of course, why we have all of the many ridges on the skin is, in part, it improves our grip surface, but it's also to increase the surface area of our skin. And that gives more receptors. We could compare that perhaps to the fovea of the eye, right? That's where you get your best detail vision. And you have a lot of cone receptors packed in very densely in the fovea. And so our hands, the palm of our hands, are a bit like our tactile foveas, if you want to use that analogy. The lips as well. We have a lot of receptors, the hairless skin on our lips, a lot of receptors that are packed in very densely there. And our face and lips get a lot of cortical regions dedicated to processing all of the input from those parts of the body here. This cross-sectional view of the spinal cord, brainstem, and brain gives us an idea here of what's happening, so that we can see coded in two signals, as I said, the blue and the green. The blue pathway is giving us that. Here it's called discriminative touch, right? So just what I said before about being able to detect different patterns, textures, objects, all of that regular touch perception, that's going in through one particular pathway. So it goes into the dorsal side of the spine. You can kind of see that here, and it travels up the spine. So we have different cross-sectional views up the spine and then into the brainstem. So there's pathways that pass through the medulla, essentially just passing through on their way up through the hindbrain. up into the midbrain through the reticular formation and then into the thalamus. So you can see that kind of in the cross-sectional view there at the very top before that projection goes into the cortex, into the parietal lobe of the brain. But what we're also seeing here is that pain pathway, notice as it enters the ventral side of the spine, one curious thing is that it crosses over to the opposite side of the spine. So if it's coming from the left side of the body, the regular discriminative touch stays on the left side of the spine, but when it comes to pain, it will cross over to the opposite side, right? So we call that ipsilateral for touch and contralateral for pain, right? So ipsilateral means same side, contralateral means opposite side. Here we see some mapping out of some of the regions of the brain that are important for various topics in this chapter. But for now, I want to focus on what we're looking at in yellow here. So that is our primary somatosensory cortex. So we see the central sulcus, as I said before, that's that main crease that separates the frontal lobe from the parietal lobe. And sitting behind that, and what's called the postcentral gyrus, that is the primary somatosensory regions of the brain, right? And this, again, is a region that maps out the various body locations in ways that are proportional to the sensitivity of that body region to touch, how many receptors are found in those different body regions. We also find, highlighted in purple here, the posterior parietal cortex, which is also important for processing touch information. But one thing we want to think about with the posterior parietal cortex is it sits very close to the occipital lobe further back that brings in all of that visual information, and how much it makes sense to think about the importance of integrating vision with body sensation that helps us enable hand-eye coordination, because I look at my hand while also feeling my hand doing things. And we talked about this when we talked about the chapter on vision, the dorsal stream of visual information, right, that travels from the occipital lobe up the back of the brain into the posterior parietal cortex, where it can be integrated with body information. That's an important part of what we call either the where channel, where things are, but also the how channel. How do I interact with it? How do I manipulate it? And of course, that means that visual and somatosensory information need to be tightly integrated here in order to achieve that level of skill. Now let's talk about pain. So the pain pathway is clearly a functional pathway, right? Why do we have the particular unique reaction to pain that makes it distinct from our sense of touch? And perhaps it has a lot to do, of course, with protection, that we need to, if something is causing us pain, we have an injury, that's a harm, right? And we need to attend to it. So of course, something about pain, it's unpleasant, of course. It feels painful, which means it's a very salient, but also very negative sensation. We can talk about what's referred to as the valence of a sensation. Valence refers to whether we attach a positive or negative value to a particular stimulus. And pain in particular, of course, has a strong negative valence, but it also is very salient. And that means it captures our attention and it holds our attention. And that's important, of course, because of a couple of reasons. One is if something is causing us harm, we want to attend to that so that we can stop that from happening, right? If there's like a bee is going to sting us, for example, I capture my attention so that I can deal with a swarm of bees that might be attacking me, right? But the idea is that I want to figure out what's hurting me, why is it hurting me, and what can I do to stop that, right? So that's an important in the immediate case term. But if I have an injury now, let's say I have fallen and twisted my ankle or even broken a bone, right? Not only is that going to immediately capture my attention so I can tend to my injury, but I also need to ensure that I let that injury heal. And that might mean not using the injured body part. So if I have twisted my ankle, I need to spend some time not putting weight on it so that it can have a chance to rest. And so if I continue to put weight on it, it continues to hurt. And so for me to avoid that sensation, it forces me to sit down and put my foot up and not walk on it for some period of time until I can tolerate walking again, which potentially would mean that it's gotten to the point where it's healed, right? So this is part of the functional reason we have pain, and it's kind of kept separate from these other basic touch discrimination pathways that are just used for just general everyday mundane tactile perception of things. So these are special nerve endings, right? One of the things about pain is that we can also describe sometimes painful stimuli as being a high pressure stimulus. We think about that, for example, pressure is defined as pounds per square inch. And so if I'm poking myself with the eraser of my pencil, as I did in the previous video, there's a certain pounds per square inch of pressure on the skin. But if I turn around and I poke my skin with a pointed, sharpened tip of the pencil, that's putting the same amount of weight, but it's all concentrated into a much more narrow location. So it's actually more, it's the same amount of pounds, but it's more pounds per square inch because I'm concentrating that pressure into a smaller point. And that correspondingly hurts a little bit in comparison to the eraser, right? And of course, if I push even harder, it increases that pounds per square inch to the point where it becomes painful if I push too hard. Or if I use something even pointier, like a needle or a knife, then that's all bets are off, right? That's going to break the skin, hurts even more. And so that's in part, these bare nerve endings are detecting that very high pressure on the skin. But some of them are also, as I have noted, are temperature receptors, because of course, if we burn the skin, that's painful as well. Sometimes even exposure to extreme cold is going to be an injury to the skin. So you get frostbite, for example. So long-term exposure to extreme cold feels painful. Holding an ice cube in your hand can sometimes even be a little bit painful, right? And so that's all designed to activate this pain pathway, because long-term exposure to extreme heat or extreme cold also causes injury. So it's going to activate the same receptor. We also have the chemical receptors as well, because we can get chemical burns on our skin, right? Capsaicin, if you like to eat hot peppers, I've grown plenty of hot peppers in my backyard, so I have all of the experience here. You get this, the burning sensation comes from the chemical stimulation. So again, in this case, it's really just the chemical that activates these receptors, right? And you're going to get the free nerve ending. You're going to get irritation of the skin as well, but you get activation of these free nerve endings that results in that distinct painful sensation. Now, as I have previously noted, the pain pathway is generally referred to as unmyelinated. Some of them really have no myelin. Some of them just have a thin myelin sheath, right? Now, we might think, why would we do that? Because myelin speeds up nerve path transmission, of course. But what we see here, though, is that we can kind of make up for this, because the pain signal oftentimes goes to not necessarily just to the cortex. Certainly it does end up in the cortex, resulting in our kind of conscious awareness of the pain, but it also gets processed a lot in the spine and brain stem, because a lot of our reactions to pain are involuntary and reflexive, right? So we're going to have much more of a rapid reaction at the cortical level to a painful stimulus. So we don't have to worry so much about the unmyelination being a significant slowdown to things. One of the ways, let's talk about how it works here. In the spine, a pain stimulus triggers the release of a neurotransmitter called glutamate, right? But it's a function of the strength of the pain. So increasing the amount of pain increases the amount of glutamate that's released. But what also happens is there's another neurotransmitter called substance P. And once we see that we are increasing substance P, that's associated with higher levels of pain. So we have two levels of pain reaction here with all of these nerve signals that travel from the spine up to the brainstem, glutamate and substance P primarily, right? But what we also want to say about all of this is that we can, once we understand the nature of these neurotransmitters that are activating the pain pathway, this may help us understand a little bit, especially if we think back to the psychopharmacology chapter about substances that either increase the effect of a neurotransmitter or decrease the effect of a neurotransmitter. Here, we might want something to work as an antagonist and decrease these neurotransmitters. So how do we relieve pain? So these are referred to as these opioid mechanisms because of the idea that there are endogenous opioids, right? These endorphins, these neurotransmitters and hormones in the body that have a very similar molecular shape to opiates like morphine and heroin. And what these receptors do, so once we release these endogenous opioids or endorphins, they activate the opioid receptors. And one of the things that this does is that on the neurons that have opioid receptors, they perform an inhibitory effect that blocks the release of the neurotransmitter substance P. So, of course, this is how endorphins or even the opiate medications reduce the intensity of pain, because this prevents substance P from being released by these other neurotransmitters. Curious thing to also say about the pain pathways is the same pathway that processes itching sensations, but itching sensations are distinct from pain, right? Just at a perceptual level, clearly they feel very different, but also even at a sensory level, they're triggered by a different kind of stimulus. What happens here is that the immune system may respond to an irritant by releasing histamines, right? And so now the histamines will activate some of the nerve endings here that triggers the itch sensation, which eventually might motivate us to scratch the itch, right? But there's a pathway that's it's kind of part of the pain pathway, but at the same time, it is also a sub path within the pain. And as I'm noting down here, it travels slowly, of course, because it's part of this unmyelinated pathway. And we don't quite respond to it quite as quickly as we do to a pain stimulus. And that might be intuitively obvious that our reactions to itches are very different than to a sudden poke or pain, right? But what's interesting about this is that there's an opponent process kind of an explanation here. We mentioned that a little bit in the chapter on vision about how colors have an opponent process pathway, that red and green and blue and yellow seem to have an opponent relationship at the level of ganglion cells and cells in the LGN of the thalamus. And something similar happens here, is that this pain pathway that transmits this information up the spine and into the brainstem appears to only either process pain or itch, but not both at the same time. And that's why they are opponents of each other, because this, if you're feeling something itchy, that seems to be blocking pain signals. And likewise, pain tends to inhibit itching sensations as well. Makes a little bit of sense if you've ever thought about the fact that sometimes if you have an injury to the skin, when it's healing, it feels itchy, right? And that's not just because, of course, the histamines are being released as a result of some of the healing processes that are happening because of the immune system doing its job, but also, of course, because that's part of that response to what was previously pain and now is being processed as an itch in its opponent half of that channel. But what's also kind of curious here is that the drugs that work to decrease the pain activation pathway, which would be those opiates that block substance P, also tend to make people feel itchy, right? People taking opioids for pain management oftentimes report that it makes them very itchy. Curiously, of course, then when you take an antihistamine, that then decreases the itch. Well, it's not curious, I guess I should say, right? But the idea is that obviously, because the histamines trigger this pathway, the antihistamine will then turn that off, right? So if you say take something to relieve pain, it may increase itch, right? If you take something to relieve itching? Does it increase pain? Well, maybe not. Although maybe there's some curious studies to be done there to see whether or not taking strong antihistamines might sensitize someone to pain a little bit, but I've never seen any studies actually supporting that view. Okay, now the second part of the notes takes us into the control of movement. And I think, again, this is a place where we want to stop. Before we go into this entire whole new set of topics.